This week, you're going to extend your understanding of macroeconomics outside the borders of the United States and begin to focus on how macroeconomics plays out in countries around the world. We're going to conclude this semester with a little bit of understanding about international macroeconomics. You can take entire courses in international economics. And in this class, all we're going to do is just get a little bit of a peek at what it looks like around the world in terms of how economies organize themselves and how they function. So we're first going to begin by looking at the notion of what's called comparative systems. We're essentially going to examine the different ways that economies can organize themselves. And there's a variety of approaches, and countries organize themselves in multiple ways. The first and really the oldest way of thinking about an economy is what's called the traditional approach. And when I say that an economy has been organized under a traditional approach, what do you think that word tradition means? So really, it just means this is the way it's always been done. Traditions are things that are passed down from one generation to another generation. We just organize ourselves this way because that's how it's always been done. There are countries in Africa, for example, that in many parts of the economy in some of those countries are traditional economies. They just simply have always worked this way for thousands of years, and this is how we're going to organize our society. Even in the United States, we have a little bit of an example of a traditional economy, even here in Kentucky, even in Western Kentucky. I'm not sure if you might be familiar with an economy or a portion of our economy that really organizes itself under traditional means. So in this country and in Western Kentucky, we have Amish. And the Amish do organize their economies based on tradition. Many families have always done the baking. Families have always done the sawmills and construction of lumber. There are families that have always raised the cattle. And that's just what you do. I remember once years ago, we often drive out to Marion, Kentucky, and shop in some of the Amish stores out there. But I remember once there's a family that had a bakery out there, the Yoder family, and we'd been going there for years, and we watched the young boy grow up. I remember early on when he was just very little and could barely reach some of the shelves, and then through the years he grows up. And I remember one of the last conversations I had with him. By this point he was a teenager, and he indicated that the bakery would be closing at that location. That they would no longer be bakers. And I was very surprised by that. And I said, well, has something gone wrong? Is there a problem? Are you all okay? And he said, no, I convinced my parents that we need to raise goats. And what struck me, I would have loved to have heard that conversation, because for generations, they probably had been bakers. And he said, I convinced my parents we need to raise goats. And so they switched from being bakers to goats. But I'm sure that was quite a conversation that was had around the dinner table. So traditions, there are some strengths and weaknesses to a traditional approach. One of the strengths might be you always know what you're going to do. Decisions are made ahead of time, and it's just the way it is. So many people would call that a strength. What weaknesses might you see with the traditional approach? So a weakness might be the decisions are made for you, and it's the way it is. And so you might end up with resources being allocated inefficiently. So for example, maybe the Yoder family, they had a great bakery, but maybe the land that they were sitting on was better for raising goats. So you might end up with an inefficient use of your resources if you just always keep doing it the same way. And then, of course, you may never be able to advance and grow very quickly. Your economy would tend to grow very slowly. Some people might view that as a positive thing, and some people might view that as a negative thing. So another way that economies will organize themselves is based on commands. So essentially, this is where the state makes the decisions. The state decides who's going to do what. The state decides who gets to own what resource. The state makes all the decisions. So can you see any positives or negatives with a command economy? So one of the positives, again, might be that decisions are made for you, and you don't have to worry about making decisions. But then, of course, as with the traditional approach, maybe one of the problems is that you don't get an efficient allocation of your resources. You have the wrong people doing the wrong things. So a command economy is just where the state, the government decides, makes all the decisions relating to the economy and how resources are allocated. So then we have the market economy. So a market economy is an economy where the market makes the decisions. If you've had microeconomics, you learned about supply and demand for individual products. And so a market economy essentially lets the market decide who gets what, who makes what price they're going to pay. It's all about supply and demand. One of the consequences of that, however, is that you get some inequity. You do have people who are wealthier than others. You have people who live in poverty because they can't afford the prices that are being charged for things. You have labor markets that result in inequity. You have people earning billions of dollars and people earning nothing. But a market economy, that's just the result of the market system. So again, one of the positives with that, however, may be that you get a more efficient allocation of your resources. You get people doing the things that maybe they really have the best skills and best resources to be doing. So the market economy might be more efficient, but it also results in more inequity. And then the reality is many economies around the world really are mixed. They have a mixture of all these different approaches. Even in the United States, for example, there are parts of the economy that are directed by command and parts of the economy that are directed by the market system. So for example, if you were somebody who had baking skills and you wanted to become a baker in this country, you can do that. The government won't prohibit you from doing that. If you believe you can make a go of being a baker in Paducah, Kentucky, you're allowed to try that. However, the government will give you some commands in that your bakery needs to be inspected, the food needs to be safe, it needs to be clean, and those are commands that are given. You can't just open up a bakery out of your kitchen, call it good when you do your dishes once a week, and say that's clean enough. The government will say that it's not clean enough. So even in this country, we really do have a mixture of these different ways of organizing our economies. So then when we think about how these economies are organized and the philosophies behind them, these are what are known as the isms. And there's really two main isms that we're going to discuss. One of them has a branch, a third ism, but we're going to start with capitalism. So under the capitalist system, most people would say, oh, that's the market system. That's where there's private ownership of the resources. And make sure that you understand these are ways of thinking about our economic system. These are not political political systems. In political science, they do use these words, but sometimes in different connotation. But in economics, we're going to use these isms to discuss how the market is organized and the thinking behind them. So under the capitalist system, we really believe that individuals should own the resources. And individuals get to make their own decisions about their resources. So you may own your own land, and you get to decide, what do you want to do with your land? Do you want to lease it out for a farmer to raise corn and soybean? Or do you want to put a shed in the back or put a pool in the back? Or what do you want to do with your land? It's your choice. There are some rules that you might have to follow, but you own the resources, your own labor. You get to decide, what do you want to do with your life? Every now and then I encounter students who they will tell me, this is what mom and dad want me to do with my life. And I mean, I've actually told parents, I said, you need to leave the office because I really don't care what you think they should do with their life. I want the student to make the decision. And I'll ask the student. And I had once had a student who said, my parents believe I should become a doctor. And the student said, but I took that biology class and it was just really gross. I hated the dissecting. I can't learn all the different parts of a body. And the student was really struggling. And I said, it's your life. You get to choose what career path you want to follow. Sometimes that's a problem, though. Sometimes people don't know what options are available. Another problem with all of these decentralized decisions is you do get inequity, and you get resources that may get concentrated in the hands of a few people. So, for example, in the United States in the late 1800s, we had individuals who owned massive amounts of land, massive corporations. If you know your history, you may remember the robber barons of the late 1800s and into the 1900s. These were individuals like Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, that had great power. And that's the result of a capitalist system. They happened to make some decisions on their own that led them to acquire more and more resources. And with that came power. Another problem with the capitalist system is that there can be inequity. Inequity leads to poverty, leads to crime, leads to personal issues that the people have to deal with. In addition to all of that, the capitalist system tends to be rather unstable in terms of the business cycle. You do get these ups and downs. Now, we had a lot of discussion about, well, what do you do about the ups and downs? But you tend to get more instability with the capitalist system because you have people making different choices and people moving and people deciding to do different things and resources being allocated in different ways, people trying new things and succeeding or failing. All of that leads to instability. So we've spent some time talking about what to do about that instability, but really the instability is a result of that freedom, that capitalist idea. So then we also have another ism called socialism. Now, socialism as an economic system really means that the government owns the resources, as opposed to capitalism, where the private individuals own the resources. So under socialist systems, socialist economic thought says that the government owns the resources: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Now, Karl Marx came along and he extended the idea of socialism and really said that economies would move from being capitalist. They would discover the problems of capitalism. They would move to socialism. They would discover the problems associated with government ownership of resources and ultimately end up in a communist type of economic system. And in the communist economic system, essentially nobody owns anything. There is no government ownership. There is no private ownership. Everybody owns everything in common. Now, you may have heard the word of a commune. So you may have thought about communes, or those hippies. They all live in an area and everybody owns everything in common. We don't really have any true communes. I remember hearing years ago an individual in California was opening a commune on his land. And the reporters never picked up on the irony of the statement. I'm opening up a commune on my land. Well, that automatically defeats the true essence of communism, because that individual kept ownership of his land. He just let a whole bunch of hippies live on his land. And they all shared houses and they shared cars and they shared food and they all worked together for their own good, but he really owned the land. And so that's really not pure communism. Communism in its purest essence essentially means nobody owns anything and we all own it in common. So that could result in a very equitable distribution of resources. Everybody owns everything in common, or even if the government owns everything. So under the socialist system, the government makes these decisions, and the government decides that everybody gets an equal amount of income. Everybody gets equal jobs to do. But that also leads to one of the inefficiencies of socialism is you may have the wrong people doing the wrong thing. So I always like to tell the story of my first roommate in college many years ago was from mainland China, and China had just emerged out of what was known as it was the Cultural War, essentially, in which the government decided they didn't want people to be educated, and they sent everybody to work on a farm and live in communes, but the government owned the land. Eventually, they realized that really wasn't the best way, and Mao Zedong died, the dictator, the ruler, he died, and then they instituted some market reforms, and one of them had to do with education. They allowed for more education in China, but the government made the decisions. So my first roommate, Ming, he was sent to the United States to learn finance. he could not add 2 plus 2 without a calculator. He hated math. He struggled to learn formulas. He worked really hard, and I mean, he did fine grade-wise, but he was absolutely miserable. However, Ming had a gift for the English language. And I remember once asking him, you know, what would you like to do if you didn't do finance? You obviously hate math. What would you really like to do? And he said, I would love to do something with the English language. I would love to write books, write poetry. I mean, frankly, he could have been a better use of resources for him to teach Chinese people the English language, as opposed to learning finance and becoming a banker. I don't know whatever happened to Ming. When we graduated, the government brought him back to China. The Chinese government brought him back to China, and I never heard from him again. So I don't know if he ever ended up pursuing his dream of writing books, or if he got stuck in a bank for the rest of his life. I don't know. Another problem with socialism is because there's government ownership, the government sort of gets to decide who the decision makers are going to be. And sometimes there ends up being a ruling class in the government, in which the people that work in the government get some perks, they get some benefits, they get better housing, they get a car, they might even get a driver. You might end up with a little bit of elitism. So while you might think that socialism results in equity, it actually might result in inequity. So if we look at the spectrum of countries around the world, China, Russia, Cuba, North Korea are more on the side of the spectrum relating to socialism, whereas many of your Western Europe, Canada, Europe, Japan, the United States are capitalist. And interestingly, Hong Kong probably is even more capitalist than the United States. In the country of Hong Kong, the territory of Hong Kong, the economy is organized such that if you want to open up businesses, you can do it. There's very few rules and regulations. The government really doesn't have a lot of say in how the businesses are run. And I've heard people come from Hong Kong indicating that it's just wild. The types of business, the number of businesses, the freedom that businesses have under that system. So the book talks about the reality that systems are not stationary. These countries don't have to stay in the system that they belong to. So, for example, Hong Kong actually is a territory. It's a special territory of mainland China. The territory has been given back to China. China has agreed to govern Hong Kong as one government, two systems, but that's being challenged in recent years. And a lot of people in Hong Kong believe that they're losing their freedoms. So that's some of the challenges that they're experiencing. China is a much more socialist, communist type of system as opposed to Hong Kong. Yet geographically, they're right next door to each other, and Hong Kong actually is a special territory of China. Cuba has opened up in recent years. Cuba has transitioned from a very communist system under Fidel Castro, and it has opened up some market reforms. It has allowed for a little bit more freedom in the businesses and what can and cannot be established. And really the same thing with Russia. Russia, if you know your history, was part of the USSR. The Soviet Union collapsed, so Russia is one country that was part of the USSR, the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia now stands as its own country. Still is a very socialist country. There are many businesses that actually are state-owned businesses. They have not been privatized. The government still owns the industries. So, for example, the gasoline industry in Russia is state-owned. The government owns that business. Same with China. China has opened up and allowed for some more market reforms, but the government still is making many of those decisions. And so you have a little bit of movement, but along with that movement comes both positives and negatives. And the people in those countries have to decide whether or not they like the positives more than they dislike the negatives. So what we've discovered in this lecture is that there are different ways of organizing our economic system. We can organize it on a traditional approach. It's just how it's always been done. We can organize it under a command approach where the government makes decisions. We can organize it under a market approach where the market makes the decisions, or we can have a mixture. And then we discussed really two main isms that talked about the beliefs behind these systems: capitalism, in which the private individual owns the resources, and socialism, where the government owns the resources. And we examined that economies can move from one system to another system. And it's not necessarily just that economies move from socialist to capitalist. You also have economies that are capitalist that are moving back towards the side of socialism. So, for example, Hong Kong is a country that is a territory that's moving back from a very capitalist system to a little bit more socialist system. So what we've examined is just some of the sort of the big ideas of how economies can organize themselves, and recognize that there are many countries in the world, and they all have different beliefs about how their economies should be organized.